We're going to get started with our webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. All right, we're live. We're going to get started with So something a little strange is happening. Hopefully this is recording. But thank you for joining us. We're going to get started. It's a little bit before, it's 1 minute before the 3 o'clock. It looks like we're having some technical difficulties, so please bear with me for a second while I figure out what is happening with our technology. I think we're back. I think we're ready. So, and it is 3 o'clock. So we're going to get started now. So welcome to the next webinar in our series, our Game Design for Student Success series. There we go. This webinar is on loops and arcs. I was doing so well in our last episode, and it just seems like this one is not cooperating. Okay, here we go. So before we get started, housekeeping notes, this will be recorded. As always, we invite you to invite your colleagues to register, because if you are registered, you will receive a reminder of each week's webinar that will be happening, as well as any handouts will be posted to our broadcast page. And so the replay and the live broadcast is happening on our broadcast page, where we will have handouts, and so you want to be registered to get them. Please post your questions and comments below. We encourage live tweeting using the hashtag GDSS, and Brooklyn Bingo just refers to our little game that we are including in this broadcast. If you hear a horn or a siren while we're live and you type Brooklyn Bingo in the comment space on the broadcast page, we will send you a $5 Starbucks gift card. So with that, let's jump into our learning objectives for today's webinar. You will learn about and how to define loops and arcs within a game design context, describe the anatomy of a loop, identify the 6 types of loops, describe the relationship of loops to arcs, describe the role of repetition in the use of loops and arcs, and that is key to these particular elements of game design. And finally, we will identify the parallel applications of this element of game design by using, I'm going to actually go through a case study with you that is completely low tech, involves no sort of online games or applications. It is purely a intervention that you would use in a higher education setting, because that's exactly how we used it. But you'll be able to see how these concepts of loops actually are applied or applicable to that setting. So first, let's start with a recap of the definition of a loop from last week's primer webinar. A loop is a cyclical sequence of activity that uses repetition to move players to mastery. So what I want to show you now is what exactly that looks like. So a loop has 4 parts. The first part of a loop is an external trigger. So if you think of it in terms of an activity that you're wanting your players, your students, your participants to engage in, the first task is to get them to do it, to get them to come into this loop, to participate in this activity. So you have to think about what is the external trigger, the trigger outside of the activity that's going to draw them into it. Then the next part of the loop is the core of it, which is the activity, some sort of engaging activity that they're going to be doing. You are going to give feedback on their progress or feedback on how they're doing with that engaging activity. There has to be an investment or a call to action. So in other words, sometimes there's an activity in a loop, or the goal of that loop, you'll see that when we move into the types of loops, that's just an experience. It's just something that you're doing. It doesn't require an investment. But a true loop, at some point in that loop, does need to ask the player to do something. So it has to have an investment, call to action. And then the loop is closed by repeating a trigger that gets them to repeat that activity. That's what makes it a loop. So they go back through that process again. What you see here, though, is with part of the factor, part of what we want to consider in our design is you also want to get to a point where the activity is engaging enough that the trigger for them to repeat the activity is internal rather than external. So rather than having to be reminded, let's say, to participate or invited to participate, they now want to participate because the experience of completing the loop is internally engaging enough. So now the trigger comes from within. So this is the basic anatomy of a loop. As we go through this webinar and we talk about the different applications and the different types, what will not change is these 4 elements: the trigger, the engaging activity, the feedback or progress, and the investment or call to action. So why are loops so important? Why are they a core building block of a game design model? And it is, in fact, a core building block because you do not have a game if you do not have a loop. Every game at its core has a loop. It's important because it is really the engine of repetition. As I indicated in the definition, it's what really makes something a loop, is that it involves repeating an activity. In our higher ed or in our learning context, it's one of the reasons why it's such a valuable starting point for applying game design principles to education. Part of the challenge we have, and as I mentioned in our primer, my focus primarily is on higher education, although this can be applicable outside of higher education. But in higher education in particular, one of the challenges that we have is that we throw a lot at students. The general education requirements of any college, so the types of the courses that students take in their first 2 years, usually cover a wide breadth of subject matter, of approaches. You're certainly going to have a variety of professors. And so what happens is, just as a student is getting accustomed to what's being asked of them in one course or by one professor, then they've got to adjust to something else. And so there's not this opportunity for them to build on top of those experiences. And what we know helps with really mastering anything is that you have to have enough practice, 1, in order to get good at it, and 2, your confidence builds, your ability to engage with what you're learning is improved if you can attach it to something that you've already done or something that you already know. That's what I mean by a hook. So repetition is part of that process of first establishing a hook and then reinforcing it. And so in learning, this notion of how are we building in opportunities for students to repeat an experience or repeat a task or a skill building activity until they get better at it, and so that they have these deep hooks to build on, is one of the first tasks that, or structures that a game design approach challenges us to think about. The other are mental models, which is not something that is probably foreign to us in higher education. Certainly by mental models, what we're talking about is what is going on inside the player or the student's head when they first approach this activity. What do they know about it? What do they think is going to be asked of them? And how much does the actual experience match what their beliefs are? How prepared are they to engage in the activity that you want them to complete? The mental model that they bring to it has a lot to do with the experience. And so part of what is happening with a loop is that you are taking the mental model of your player and you are adapting it over time. Over the course of completing that loop, you are either confirming through the feedback and call to action that they were correct in what they expected, or you're helping them to adapt their mental model if the mental model they enter into that experience with is different than what is going to be required for them to succeed. So it's important to acknowledge or to recognize that part of what we're doing when we think about creating a loop around an activity is that it's going to require us to address and adapt the mental models of the player. And what games also have are rules and feedback. So I use the term rule cautiously. Certainly in games, there are rules. When we talk about education in general and higher education in particular, we try to tend to move away from the type of very strict confines that the word rule implies. And we want learning to be flexible and engaging. And so to the extent the word rule seems like it's contrary to that, don't worry about the specific word. think more about what it represents. All that rules and feedback really mean is that there's some sort of reliable, predictable structure that you're introducing the player to so that they know what to expect, what they need to do, and the experience and the feedback reinforces that. So that those are sort of the core elements of loops and repetition and why they're so important to game design and why they're also so helpful and applicable to what we want to do in terms of applying game design to student success. So let's talk about the types of loops. As I mentioned, there are 6 different types of loops. Again, all have these 4 elements. The first is effort and skill building. So, excuse me, the first type of loop is effort. And so these are all going to be skill building loops. That's our whole purpose. But effort speaks to more of a non-cognitive load. So again, if you think about the little graphic that we used about it being effort and load and balancing. So an effort loop focuses on skill building when it's non-cognitive. A complexity loop is more of a cognitive type of load. So we're talking about skill building that's around an activity that's more difficult. And again, I'm going to define each of them more closely after we go through the list. The third type is power loop. The fourth type is a display loop. The fifth is a relationship loop. And the sixth is engagement. So 6 different types of loops. That means you have 6 different options. Think of the types of loops as marrying the purpose of what you want to accomplish, that there's a loop for a particular purpose that you want to achieve with the loop that you're creating and the activity that you're inviting the player or the student to participate in. So let's look at each more closely. An effort loop would be one that you apply when the activity that or your goal or your purpose requires persistent effort. So it's not that it's necessarily challenging or difficult beyond the fact that it's going to require you to stick with something that you might not enjoy, right? So think of examples like pre-class assignments. Any of us who are faculty have this experience of you have assignments on the syllabus, you give out an entire syllabus for the entire semester of reading or maybe videos they need to watch or assignments they need to complete before they come to class so that the time you spend in class is more useful and more helpful. But they don't do it, right? So we're not necessarily talking about assignments that are hard. So let's say it's reading a chapter. It's not that it's hard to do necessarily. It's just work. Participation consistency. So maybe it's something that you want to ask them to do. Let's say, coming to tutoring or coming to an event that they need to do every week in order for them to get the benefit of it. They just have to show up and follow whatever the instructions are for their participation, but you can't get them to attend consistently. Attention to detail. So how many times do we tell students make sure that your paper is formatted according to APA, but they don't pay attention to it, or proof it for grammar or typos? Or timely responses. This would be an instance where now you're dealing with just asking students who are sophomores to make sure they register by this date, but they don't pay attention to the email or they don't respond to the call to action. All of these are examples of activities that we might want to get to encourage different behavior, where we actually just need them to follow through with that effort. These would be categories of challenges or activities, could be class level or program level, for which an effort loop would be the kind of loop you're thinking of designing. The next now is a complexity loop. This is where the task is challenging, is difficult. So now, for instance, we're talking about courses or the content in courses that have high DFW weights, high drop, fail, withdraw. So maybe it's math or science. Now we're talking about complexity loops would be the types of a loop designed around addressing the fact that, in fact, what they need to do is going to be difficult. Challenging subject matter is involved. And so clearly the faculty often who teach these courses, who teach math and science courses and have the really wonderful feedback from students, they put the work in to try to figure out how do we break something complicated into small, manageable pieces that help them to understand it. If you've done that as a faculty member, or you work with someone who's a faculty member who's really good at making something understandable that is typically challenging, one way to look at it is they're constructing complexity loops. They are breaking down in small pieces and making it less complex and easier to understand and easier to practice so that students can develop proficiency at it. Anything that's a multi-step process is a good candidate for a complexity loop, because the complexity may just come from getting lost along the way. So you want to think in terms of breaking down each of those steps so that they're easy to follow. And navigating bureaucracy. So I'm giving you examples that could be at the course level, the campus level, the program level. So if there's just a lot of different steps in terms of who they need to see or who they need to get approvals from in your system, you might want to make a game of it, again, by thinking in terms of a complexity loop. How can we break down these different processes so it's easier to follow, and if we can inject some fun into the process of completing it. So these are examples of where a complexity loop approach or type of loop would be an approach you might want to take. The next is a power loop. The goal of a power loop is to build a sense of accomplishment and self-efficacy. So what we do here is, in times when it's important, and what you'll start to see now is how these loops may overlap with each other in terms of one supporting the other. So for example, you may want a power loop to follow a complexity loop, because the goal of the loop is, if it's something challenging you're teaching someone to do, you want them to feel this sense of accomplishment and confidence that they can actually accomplish it. So what a power loop will have are small wins that help them to feel that sense of accomplishment. They build persistence because they give the player a reason to stick with it. What distinguishes a power loop is this concept of leveling up, right? So that loop is the loop that would dictate or would determine that the player would now move to the next level of something. And it's that process of leveling up that helps to create that feeling of accomplishment and self-efficacy. So again, in the course of how you're mapping out what you want to apply a game design principle to, this is a type of loop that would serve a specific purpose in that design. And again, as part of that leveling up process, part of what you might do with a power loop also is that completing that loop is the thing that unlocks power or privilege or ability. So that's the feature of the loop that allows it to serve that purpose. A display loop builds confidence and self-esteem. So it's a form of recognition. So this may be the loop that the cycle of that activity results in some sort of recognition that you've accomplished something. It also is a way of documenting progress. So it's something that the word display means that the payoff for that loop, right? The trigger or the call to action, the feedback, the form of that loop includes something that the player can display to indicate that they've achieved something. Documents progress. It's a form of feedback. It can also serve as a wayfinding signal. So as you have more advanced players in the game being able to display recognition of what they've achieved, newer players see visually that this is what they should be aspiring to. So the display loop can be very, very helpful as a part of a broader scheme in serving the purpose of signaling where you want the players to go, where they should be aspiring to go. Relationship loop, to me, is one of the most important and overlooked. One of the comments that I made in our primer last week was that the game design for student success model is based on the premise that incorporated into the design must be relationships among students, must be relationship oriented. So the relationship loop is specific to that goal, facilitates connection with others. So why do we want a relationship loop? It is what helps you with developing a sense of belonging amongst a group. It facilitates identity safety. What do I mean by that? On our college campuses, in particular, for those of us who are working with or interested in working with populations that may be at higher risk of dropping out, what we are learning increasingly is that it's the non-cognitive barriers that often get in the way of them progressing, even where you have resources that would help them with any cognitive barriers that may exist. So yes, you might have students who need some developmental work or are struggling with a particular topic. Most schools, we found at the work that we do, most colleges and universities have resources to help students with them. They have tutoring. They have dedicated, advisors and assistants that can help students overcome what kind of cognitive or tactical limitation they may have that might impede them from finishing that hard course. But those resources are being underused for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons sometimes is identity issues. There's a lot of work being done around not only grit, But the term that we hear used a lot is imposter syndrome. Just this feeling that when I run into difficulty, it's a signal that I don't belong here, right? It's this belief that, oh, 10 people may have failed that test. But let's say if I'm a first generation college student and I already am insecure about my place in college, I'm not going to experience that D or that F on that quiz the same way as a student who's a continuing generation student, because that continuing generation student may think, I guess I didn't study enough. Let me do something different. But that first generation student may think, you know what? I knew I didn't belong here. This is what I mean by identity. And so identity safety in relation to a relationship loop is if you're building in loops that allow students to connect with each other, that allow another student who's a first generation student to say to a peer, to a near peer, you know what? Everybody has that problem. I had the same experience as well. Here's how I got through it. You can do the same. That it's those relationships that can change those identity scripts, those identity mental models, said earlier, that might be interfering with the goals you have for your students. Relationship loops, relationship building does that better than anything else. So it's really important to think about that as its own loop. Obviously, along with that, it can help with retention and persistence. And then it's also, relationship loops can also provide a sense of social proof. So sometimes just having, I've used this example so many times, but this example of I, as a professor, can make a recommendation to a student and they'll look at me and say, okay, yeah, that sounds interesting. But if a classmate recommends the same thing, so let's say we're talking about tutoring, I can tell a student, you need to go to the tutor will help you. And they'll say yes. But if a classmate says, oh, you should go to this tutor, it really helped me, the response is so much different. And the student is much more likely to follow that advice. And part of that is because it provides social proof. When my peer says something, then it has, more credibility. I'm more likely to listen to it. All of that is true because of the relationship. I'm going to come back to this point. We have several webinars coming up in this series where we'll be able to drill down further on the importance of relationship. But let me just say this as a precursor to that deeper conversation. Our experience at Learning Gateway, my experience as an educator, tells me definitively that relationship building helps skill building. I'll say that again. Relationship building helps skill building. So I'm more likely to take the actions that are needed to be taken. I'm more likely to have confidence. I'm more likely to believe the advice that I'm getting if I have a relationship with the person who's helping me make that connection. So I can't stress enough the importance of incorporating relationship building in your design. This loop is the loop that specifically calls that out. And our last loop is an engagement loop. And so the purpose of that loop is to deepen commitment to not just the individual activity, but the broader program or the broader goal or objective that your loop, your game design is being applied to achieve. So what engagement loops have going for them by way of characteristic, excuse me, it looks like I have something, is they are graduated investments. They provide meaningful feedback, internal triggers. These are the characteristics of an engagement loop. And they're key to intrinsic motivation. So these are the things that you're thinking about. I also believe I mentioned in our last webinar, the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation and the difference between external and internal rewards. And that while all games have some measure of external reward, those external triggers we talked about, there's always going to be an extrinsic aspect of a game design approach. But that really good game design builds in intrinsic motivation. Your engagement loop is a really important tool to that. And these elements that I mentioned here, that you're graduating investment, that you're providing meaningful feedback, this is how you do that. So you definitely want to make sure that engagement loops are part of your toolkit. So we now know what the anatomy is. We know what the different types of loops are that we have at our disposal. How can we mess this up? So let's talk about, what are the things that get in the way of us using these tools effectively. The first is not having a clear objective. So when you start thinking about game design, and I hope, now that we're getting into the heart of this series, the goal is really to start rolling up your sleeves and applying some of these principles. So as you start thinking about, okay, I want to use game design, your first start is, well, what do I want it to use game design to achieve? What is my objective? It needs to be clear and concrete and as specific as possible, because that's going to help you decide what loops do I need and why, right? The next way that you can run into trouble is missing parts of the anatomy. So remember, there are 4 parts to a loop, not 3, not 2. The trigger, the engaging activity, the feedback or progress, and the investment/call to action. You must have all 4 parts. If you're missing a part, that's usually why your game design approach isn't quite working. And the third and very common issue that will come up that will cause your plan to start to fall apart or to stall is that you're trying to pack too much into a loop. There are only 4 parts of it. And often I'll hear people that I work with on this say, okay, I want to do all of these things and try to call it a loop. No, you're trying to get too much into it. So that brings us to the next part, which are arcs. Most important objectives that you have, especially in education, aren't going to be solvable by one loop. And that's why we have arcs. So we have our definition of a loop. An arc, as you may remember from last week's primer, is unidirectional sequence of activities that uses a sense of progress to move players to mastery. And so the reason why we're doing loops and arcs together is that they go together. An arc is a collection of connected loops. So as you have this objective that you're trying to achieve, typically it's going to be through a series of loops together that's going to get you there. The sense of progress comes from movement in one direction. So you're connecting those loops intentionally to move the player forward. Now, there are 2 types of arcs: accomplishment and discovery. I think it's really helpful to think about that. I think our default is to think about what, in essence, is an accomplishment arc. That is, they're going to complete a series of activities towards mastery to indicate that they've accomplished some level of expertise, completed some challenge. That's fine. But there are times when your goal is simply to expose the player to something, to allow them to discover something. This too, I think, is completely appropriate and consistent with what we do in higher education. We want them to discover new topics, new ideas, new concepts. So I hope it's helpful to see that you can also apply these approaches. You can also apply this game design principle to subject matter, to goals, to objectives, where what you're just trying to do is explore or expose your student, your player, to something new. Often discovery is a precursor to accomplishment. That's another way to look at it. Arcs can be both major or minor. So you see the example I give. A major arc would be progress to graduation. So we can see going from a freshman to a graduating senior is one major arc, and every class rank is a loop on that arc. However, when arcs are that big and take that long, what you're also creating is a lot of opportunities, as we see by our challenges with retention and persistence. You just create larger gaps in between each level for a student or a player to fall through. And that's why minor arcs are so important. Within each of those major arcs, you want a smaller cluster of loops that allow players to feel a sense of progress. It can really get hard to feel like you're making progress between freshman and sophomore year, because that's 30 credits you've got to amass. Within that, what kinds of minor arcs can we create within a class, within the first semester, within the first couple of weeks? We see schools, you do that with your rituals and accomplishments. All of those are forms of creating little arcs so that your player feels like, yes, I can see that I'm making progress. So it's important to use a combination of both. Minor arcs can contain the same types of loops, or they can contain a combination of different loops. If you recall, my homework for you from the last webinar was to download a new game and pay attention to how they got you started and taught you the game. In the earlier stages, very often you will complete the same type of loop more than once. So the same sequence of activities, the same types of burgers. You're going to complete several times before they're going to introduce a new food group. Let's say if you're doing a cooking game. And that's so that depending on what the challenges of the arc, depending on the difficulty or the complexity of what needs to be taught, you determine as a designer, do they need to practice this one thing several times, or do we just need to break this up so that these 5 things they need to do, they're not individually hard, but they're complex. Remember in the loops we talked about, let's say a complexity loop could just be there's a bureaucracy. So they don't need to do the same thing more than once, but they need to do one thing and then the next thing and then the next thing. So that might be different types of loops, as opposed to, nope, they need to repeat this one activity several times until they've mastered it. So think in terms of that. Every loop is one cycle of all 4 parts. So here again is a way of understanding why it is you might have an arc where you have the same type of arc in the same type of loop in an arc several times, because each loop is one cycle. So you don't want to, so that is how you make sure that you're not repeating the same thing. Again, it's trigger, engaging activity, feedback, and investment. What you don't want to do is stack parts of the loop. So in other words, there should not be a trigger going into 4 different types of engaging activity before the feedback and then before the investment, because now this is how you're breaking the loop. It is one activity at a time that gets feedback, that then calls for investment and then gets repeated. All right, so let's take a look at what this might mean in an educational example that involves no application, no phone app, no fun little gadget. This is purely a learning activity where we can see the equivalent of loops on display. The Able Writing Workshop is the objective of the ARC was to move standard English learners from developmental to proficient. So what we're talking about is students who are entering college who would need developmental writing or reading. They were not writing yet at the college level. We developed this workshop for use. It's been applied in college settings. It's also been applied in high school settings. And it was based on the Ponsodine method, an approach that was created by Marie Ponceau, actually, from the City University of New York in Queens. So to give you the quick backstory of Marie Ponceau, she was teaching at Queens College. It was a group of students whose writing deficiency was so bad that, other faculty did not want to teach them. They didn't believe that even the first level remediation course was going to work. They had that level of difficulty in really mastering the basics of writing that would be necessary for college. And Marie Ponceau said, I can teach them. And she came up with this method that she committed to using. And as I understand the story, within one 16-week semester, she was able to move them to a level of proficiency that allowed them to enter into regular college level writing courses. Now, it was an intensive 16 weeks. There were a lot of hours of class, but it's the steps that she used that are so important. And we used her model with fidelity because there's so much of it that was just, in my opinion, brilliant. And if you want to read more about it, the book that documents it is called Beat Not the Poor Desk. But let me go just into what the steps are to show you how they map to the loops. So her goal with this method was to present writing as something that the students could not get wrong. And that is so familiar to the way that game designers approach it. So again, when I mentioned downloading a new game and starting from scratch, one of the things that you will notice when you download a game on your phone and you play that very first experience, right? The very first task that you're asked to do, which you now know, since you're becoming a game design expert, you now know that first sequence of activities is a loop. When you play that the first time, you never lose. You never lose. Tell me a game that you play online where the very first time you played, you got the X, or you got kicked out, or you couldn't complete it. The very first loop is always a winning loop. One, it usually has a lot of pointers and directions. It might give you arrows and tell you what to do next. It walks you through, or it just gives you the simplest version of the series of tasks you're going to complete. However they do it, they make sure that you cannot lose. And that is a basic game design principle, because it's part of how they make sure that you want to keep playing. If it's too hard, too fast, or too slow, they will make sure that you lose. And that is a basic game design principle, because it's part of how they make sure that you want to keep playing. If it's too hard, too fast, or too slow, they will make sure that you lose. And that is a basic game design principle, because it's part of how they make sure that you want to keep playing. If it's too hard, too fast, some players are going to give up, but it's always the task of a game designer to keep players playing. That's the fundamental idea. Get players playing and keeping them playing. So Marie Ponceau's idea that she wanted students to experience writing as something that they could not get wrong was extremely powerful. And so the first step of every workshop session, is to start with 10 minutes of free writing. So this I call an effort loop. Why? This is free writing. There's no assignment. They're not telling them what to write. But what she did direct in this method is that you want them to get into the habit of writing. That's what we mean by an effort loop. You're just going to write for 10 minutes, and every session starts out that way so that you get in the habit of writing. And what we instruct the students in this method is, when they first do it, there's a lot of anxiety and apprehension about writing. And so you'll have students that say, well, I don't know what to write. I don't have anything to write. And so the instruction is, if you can't think of anything to write, just just keep writing. But you don't put your pencil down for 10 minutes. Write whatever comes to your mind. You can write whatever you want. Invariably, with those instructions, no limitations, no way to get it wrong because they control what they write. They can write the same word over and over again. Invariably, they do come up with something to write. And over the course of the sessions, whether it's one weekly session or every day, every session they get into that habit. And what happens without exception is by the fourth or the sixth session, the habit of doing it becomes something that just becomes easier because of the repetition. And so instead of what starts out with a few students who are struggling and pouting and moping about having to write for 10 minutes, but doing it because you don't allow them to put the pencil down, becomes students who feel that 10 minutes is not enough just because they kept doing it. So that's an example of an effort loop. It was just a loop of activity, very simple, that they continue to do to get into the habit of doing it. Part of the process then is that the writing tasks eventually increase. So I'm now going to reveal why it's called the Able Writing Workshop. So the structure of this writing workshop is that students start out by writing a fable. And in the very first session, after they finish their 10 minutes of free writing, they're actually given a format for what the fable looks like. They're literally told, these are the words you start with. The horse said, comma, X. You literally tell them what to do, and then you have a little piece that they fill in. Then you give them the second line. You literally say to them, and on the second line, write, and you tell them what to write and the part that they fill in. On the third line, write, and then you give them the first part that starts the sentence and they fill it out. And you do that for 6 lines, telling them exactly what to do. So again, like our introduction to game, their first task writing, the first time they have to write something where they're given an assignment, it is presented to them in a way that they can't get wrong. They complete that first fable, and then they continue to write fables, different types of introductions, different types of purposes, but they continue to write this very small chunk of writing until they get comfortable with it, and then they move from fables to writing parables. Now, again, it's a wonderful workshop. I don't want to get into too much of the detail because that's not our purpose here. But the process of gradually increasing the length and demand of the assignment is an example of a power loop. So they're gradually leveling up in what they're being asked to do. It's gradually getting more complex, but only in small increments so that they're not overwhelmed and they never believe it's something that they can't do. In the process of writing longer, writing something more complex, it builds their confidence, their self-esteem. And so these are the elements of a power loop. So how do they continue to build skill? Well, it's a group evaluation process. One, everyone writes in every class. Everyone has to write. No one has the option of just not writing. The work is critiqued as a group. And this is where the relationship loop comes in. So initially, students will volunteer who wants to share their fable, and then what they've written is presented up on the board. And as a group, the entire group of the workshop reads it out loud, talks together about what part of the sentence could be made a little bit differently, it could be written differently, word choice. By critiquing as a group in a non-threatening environment, because everyone eventually presents work, there's incentive for them to be, kind and respectful to each other. They're building a relationship. But what's also really valuable about this method and interesting is that there's never, again, you're teaching developmental learners. There's never a period of time where you're lecturing to them about punctuation or about subject-verb agreement. Instead, as you're looking at the work that's being presented, when there is an instance of subject-verb disagreement and the group describes out loud or reads out loud and they identify, there's something wrong with the sentence, it could be worded better, the instructor then takes the opportunity in the moment to point out what it is that they've identified, what it's called, and how it can be fixed. They critique it as a group. Now you're taking something that would be complex, because again, if you're a novice learner with learning the rules of grammar, typically it's very off-putting because it seems like a lot of rules. And so this approach to teaching it by just weaving it into the communal process of critiquing has taken something complex and broken it down into manageable steps. That is an illustration of a complexity loop. Students control the evaluation process. They determine when they are going to present something or submit something for group evaluation. They also get to choose when it's submitted for formal evaluation to the instructor. And so this process of allowing them to control the evaluation process, doing it as a part of a group, giving them meaningful feedback are all illustrations of an engagement loop, because as this relationship is built, as the workshop proceeds and other people are receiving feedback, invariably, even the shyest, most low confidence participant wants to be a part of that process. But now they insert themselves into the process because they want to. Again, so we're talking about intrinsic motivation. It's really designed as a perfect illustration of an engagement loop. The process over time draws the student in, just like participating and making repeated investments, getting meaningful feedback draws the student in. In this process, the way that we do this in the workshop, we have a checklist. We call it a proficiency ladder. So we have examples of good writing, of what are the elements of college level writing broken down into discrete elements. So students decide when they believe they've produced a piece of writing that demonstrates this criteria. And again, that's what we mean by them controlling the evaluation process. When they believe that they have demonstrated, let's say, parallel structure, or they believe that they've demonstrated a strong sense of, examples of subject-verb agreement in a sentence, they present it, it's evaluated, and then it's checked off as a competence that they have. And once they have completed this ladder of proficiency, they have submitted work that covers each of the elements on this list. The highest level, the last assignment in the workshop, the ability that once they've completed it, they have, graduated from this workshop, is that they actually lead a critique of other papers. So they get to take the role that the instructor takes and helps to lead a group critique of work. This is a form of recognition, right? So it's a public recognition that, hey, I've gotten to the point where now I've had enough experience with this. I know how to do this. And something that every participant in the workshop eventually will be able to do. So it's, as I mentioned in the display loop, now you've got this public recognition that you've reached a certain milestone. It comes with a set of privileges. Everyone can see it, and everyone else who is in this relationship and in this game, in this experience, knows it's something that eventually they will be able to do as well. So again, this is just using one example of a workshop that we do. Again, as you heard me mention, no technology whatsoever. Literally, we only use pen and paper and whiteboards for this. So there's no technology whatsoever. And yet we are applying, or we're seeing illustrated, how these different loops of game design placed together can result in an arc. The arc being that they increase in their proficiency, in their ability, and eventually move to a place where they've leveled up and they no longer need this kind of instruction. So key questions for building arcs. So as we move to now, how do you apply this? Think of it in terms of questions that you need to ask yourself. What are the starting mental models? So for whatever students you want to engage, for the activity that you want to build this arc towards, the goal or objective that you have, what's the mental model that they are going to come into it with? So the mental model that our students may have been coming into our writing workshop with was, I can't write. This is not something I'm good at. I don't know how to do it. I don't like it, and I'm never going to get good at it. So knowing that that's the starting mental model, then we know that this is something that needs to change. How will these mental models change? So part of it is with approaching it. And literally when we start out, I mentioned that the goal of that writing workshop was to present writing as something they couldn't get wrong. That is something literally that I would say to the students in the first session. You are going to love writing. Do you love writing now? Most of them would say no. You will love writing. You are going to enjoy this. This is something that you're going to find fun, even in this first session. They're very skeptical, but then it's designed in such a way that I know we've put the steps together so that it will change their mental model about whether they can write, whether they're good at it. It starts to change, and it's designed intentionally. So again, how will the mental model need to change? In our example of the writing workshop, they need to change from believing writing is something they can't do, something that they can't enjoy, to something that they realize they can do, that they will enjoy. What actions would help them to change this? So in our example, well, we started out with 10 minutes of writing, anything that they wanted to do. So we started out with an activity that they could not get wrong, that they could not fail at. So that's what you want to think about. The activity, the objective that you have for them, that very first loop, how can you design the loop so that they can complete it and it is not possible for that first loop to end in failure, right? But in the process, how will these loops that we're connecting help them to change their mental model, help them to change their proficiency? What are the structures that will reinforce this? So this goes back to the earlier slide of rules. So instead of using rules, think of them in terms of what support structures are we putting in place to make sure that they cannot fail, to make sure that we're checking in with them, and that the journey that we want this arc to take them on is one that they complete and they are experiencing it the way that we intend. So an example is, that first 10 minutes of writing, by putting in a structure that says, all you have to do is keep writing. I don't care what you write. I don't care if you write the same word for 10 minutes. Keep writing. This is a structure that they can complete, but it's also a structure that does not allow them to opt out of it, but does it in a way that is something they can manage. Then moving them to their first fable, but making sure that there's so much structure to it that, again, they can't fail at it, but they're also getting the message that this is what is expected, right? So you're thinking through how the structure of the experience reinforces the activities that you want them to engage in. What kind of feedback will confirm it? So this is an example of feedback that you give just through the writing process of how it's designed. Feedback doesn't have to be very complicated, but you want to make sure, are you sure they're getting feedback on how they're doing in that activity? That's why we say every element, every part of that loop has to be included. Often if you're struggling with something, it's because something is missing, which leads us to that last thing to consider. Think ahead of how this might break. What's going to be difficult? And it may be that as you're mapping out your sequence, that if there's a part you're struggling with, I'm not sure how to give them feedback, then that's where to stop and think, well, there's always a way to give feedback. Is it that we're having a hard time giving feedback because maybe we're trying to put too much in the engaging activity, or maybe we need to design the activity differently? But you always want to make sure that within that loop, you've got all of those experiences, all of those elements. And so if you anticipate what might break them, then you also can start to make adjustments to how you design it. So we have a handout, a canvas for you to start playing around with this, to start thinking. So I'll just quickly walk through. As I said, you always want to start out with an objective. So write out your objective. It's very rare that your objective, as I said earlier, is going to be one loop. So think of it in terms of what's the arc, but it doesn't have to be a very complicated arc. So what you have here is you want to number your tasks, so you can make copies of this canvas if you want, but think of it in terms of they should go in an order. What's the first experience? Remember we talked about that first loop should be something that they cannot fail. What type of loop would it be? And then what goes in each of those boxes? What are you going to have them do? Then what's the next one? Then what's the next one? If you're struggling, if you're running into difficulty mapping it out, probably the issue is you're trying to do too much. And then you probably, if you look at it closely, you have what should be maybe 2 or 3 loops that you're trying to pack into one. So that's always a challenge. That's one of the things that we struggle with, I think, as educators, because sometimes we haven't really thought of how do we make it simple. And I would submit, if this is something you're thinking about as an educator, as opposed to, let's say, a program director, and your challenge is just to get people to use the resources. That's one sequence of activities. But if you're thinking about applying this to a classroom, remember that as it's difficult to remember what it feels like to be a novice. So if this is a subject matter that you have been teaching for a long time, it is almost impossible for you to understand or remember what it feels like to not have any clue about what this means, what the subject matter means. That is why it's really helpful to include students in this design process, to hear from their voices. What does it feel like when you're encountering this for the first time? It can give you a sense of where you should break apart these loops and where you should start. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions that have been posted on our page. And you just bear with me. In the meantime, I'll stay on. We have about another 10 minutes, as we generally want to give this about an hour. So we have about 10 minutes of before we would be signing off. If there are any questions, I'm going to quickly just take a look and see if we have any. If not, in the comment section, I don't see any. Then what I will say is we will pick up next week with our progression and flow. So progression and flow is the next step in this process. Your loops and arcs together are the first building blocks of moving your students or your players to mastery. Progression and flow now give us that broader context of how we do that. And so we'll talk about that in the next week. I, again, as always, invite you to make sure that you post any questions. At any point that you're watching this, it's never too late to come back to the page and post questions. We'll keep an eye on it, and we will certainly answer them for you. I thank you for participating. If there are no other questions, and look forward to hopefully having you with us again next week. With that, we're going to sign off. Thank you again for participating in the webinar, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode.